Hello and welcome to Contra Mundum. I am your host, Pastor Andrew Isker, and I am now officially the chief Christian nationalist activist in America, according to James Lindsay. So you heard it here first. I've been promoted. Please welcome my co-host, CJ Engel. Hello, CJ.
Hey, Andrew. I'm excited.
How was your week, CJ?
I'm excited for this one.
How was your week, CJ?
My week was great. I've been chewing lots of Greco gum. My Twitter feed has been blowing up, which I always get excited, and then I'm like, wait, I don't like this at all. It's very tiresome. But I did some short like James Lindsay dunking, and it went kind of crazy. So it's always
very easy to do, and you always gets returns. So that's it's great. And also it is my absolute pleasure to introduce to you our guest for this week, Mr. Charles Haywood. Charles Haywood, his blog is The Worthy House. He is online at The Worthy House, all one word, on Twitter. He is a guy and again, I'm not trying to flatter him here, but this is a guy, and this is gonna be tough for him to live up to, but I think he could do it. There's so many people online. I'm like, this guy, he has a good understanding of stuff, at a 75 or 80% clip. Like, this guy's really good. That's typically how I look at most people. But with Charles, his political analysis, his understanding of political theory, history, just the current context of the battles before us and so forth. I always look at it, I'm like, this guy gets it. Every time I read something, I'm like, whoa. This guy really gets it, and so this is big shoes I'm putting you in, and I know you're going to live up to them. But please welcome Charles Haywood.
That is a fantastic introduction. In fact, I'll slice that out and I'll give it to future people who chose to appear on the topic. So
yeah, perfect.
And I am pleased to be here.
Oh, thank you so much for giving us your time here today. And one of the topics, especially, all three of us are interested in. CJ got attacked last week online because of this, because he really likes this mid 20th century political thinker. So you know what that means. And so CJ was attacked over liking Carl Schmitt, saying, "Hey, Carl Schmitt had some good ideas." And of course, I've written about him. I've referenced him before in some of the things I've written. And CJ has, and of course, you have as well, Charles. So I think that's, right off the bat, we should talk about Charles Schmitt, especially because it feels like more and more people in the online right are beginning to understand the failures of liberalism. There was the article by Paul Gottfried we referenced on this show a few weeks ago about the failures of liberalism being what led to wokeness. I think it was a very accurate appraisal of the situation. And so Schmitt is one of the original critics of liberalism from the right, even though he wasn't really necessarily this like anti-liberal guy. He wanted to maintain the political order that existed, but he knew that there's simply no way that it could defend itself within its own parameters. So before I botch everything, I'll let the experts that I have here with me talk about it. But what do you?
The substance of Carl Schmitt? Did you see the T-shirt I posted online that I had made?
No,
I don't know if they did. This was actually a friend of mine suggested part of this, so I can't claim total credit for it. But those signs that say, "In this neighborhood, we believe."
Oh yes, I did see this. Yes,
I have this both this meme, and I had a shirt made that says, "In this neighborhood, we decide the state of exception and who is friend, who is enemy." So, which of course are both famous Carl Schmitt taglines. Sovereign is he who decides the state of exception and friend-enemy distinction. So I'm going to wear this shirt to Costco and stuff, but I'm pretty sure no one's going to get the joke. That's the sad thing. I wasn't going to make a yard sign, but my wife was like, "No one's going to get the joke."
No. That's just it. Like I make jokes like that. People that just over everybody's head. Like Josh Abitoy, he tweeted, "Hey, I'm not a Christian nationalist. I just want more exception deciders to be Christians." It's like I thought that was hilarious, and it got like 10 likes, and I'm like, "Come on!"
That's poor Josh. Anyway,
I know.
So I mean, I'm a big Carl Schmitt fan. Schmitt, I mean, I am hardly a Carl Schmitt expert. Someone like Paul Gottfried is obviously a Carl Schmitt Edward. I think CJ knows probably way more about Schmitt than I do, but I have been working my way through chronologically all of Schmitt's works and trying to link them together into somewhat of an overarching framework, which is difficult, both because they're difficult works and because Schmitt is notoriously protean in the sense that the stuff he says from one book to the next does not necessarily fit neatly together. And that's because Schmitt, of course, is the opposite of an ideologue. An ideologue being someone who has a preconceived philosophical or intellectual framework into which he tries to force reality, whereas Schmitt was trying to fit reality into an intellectual framework in some of the most chaotic times that that the West has ever seen. So you got to give the guy some slack.
I think modern readers have a hard time with Schmitt. It's not just Schmitt, but it's anyone who kind of came before like the 1950s, like because people used to talk about. I mean, even the entire English tradition, all those people used to talk about theory in terms of what the political needs were of the time. That's kind of how theory came about, and that's why it's hard to read Schmitt because people, for a number of reasons, have no idea what happened in Germany in the 1920s when Schmitt was at his heyday. And so it's hard to understand and derive things from Schmitt by just reading his commentary on current German situation.
Yeah, I mean, you can do it. I think most of the modern English translations have pretty good notes, so that helps. I mean, some of them are hostile notes. It's not too bad, and there's a couple different translators and so on. But you do have to come to it with some knowledge of some fairly detailed knowledge of the history that doesn't come from Wikipedia.
Yes. So I mean, I guess we've kind of danced around Schmitt a little bit, but I mean his big point is friend enemy distinction and all of these things, and of course you see it used in this kind of low IQ way where it's this very simplistic friend enemy grug brain kind of thing. You see this. I mean, it's almost the same way. Charles, I don't know how familiar you are with like Vantillian presuppositional apologetics and theology, but there were in that world, in the Reformed evangelical world, Van Til. I've moved away from this. CJ can attest to that, but there is this thing where all this brilliant thinker who has volumes and volumes of work, all of his thinking is reduced down to by what standard, and that's like the argument. By what standard? That's the only thing people could parrot this idea, and it's really stupid when they do just that.
Yeah.
It's the same thing with Schmitt, where it's like, oh, friend enemy distinction. Here we go. Like there's way more to it than that. I mean, some of it is like you read concept of the political, and he's like you said, he's working really backward from just the basics of what is the political, what is politics, and how do we understand this? And it's really this basic distinction, right? Just like all these other spheres of life are built out of these distinctions, right?
Yes.
Here within politics, it's the distinction between friend and enemy, and what is a friend, what is an enemy. Who and the enemy, of course, in Schmitt's terminology, is the other, is this person that who poses an existential threat to your existence or to your people's existence, and so like it's way deeper than that. Like he's deriving the entire understanding of politics from this principle, rather than just saying, okay, here's how you do politics. You got your friends here and your enemies over there, and you have a clear black and white thing here. Like it's way deeper than that, way more than that. So I guess flesh that out some more for me, and what he means. What is the friend enemy distinction, and how does it fill out this politics that he has, or his understanding of reality, really?
Is that me or CJ?
Charles, you go ahead, and then CJ will bounce off.
Right.
Of whatever.
I'm not certain that I'm qualified to be the Schmitt expert. I did, however, do the concept of the political several months ago, and I think that the brief summary at kind of the top level that you gave is accurate. I think closely relates to a lot of Schmitt's writings. And you see this in, for example, The Crisis of Parliamentary Democracy, and you also see it in Legality and Legitimacy, which is, as I said, the work I'm working on now. This idea that to have any kind of coherent polity that revolves around popular participation, whether that's straight democracy or a parliamentary system. And he goes to great lengths to precisely define these things rather than loosely using terms like democracy as people do nowadays. Anything that purports to embody indirectly or directly the popular will relies on that society fundamentally being a unity. That is, on having a set of norms, and he uses the terms norms a lot, for example, in Legality and Legitimacy, that you can't have any system like that if there's too much divergence among the first principles of the people in that country. And I think that relates, though he doesn't, as far as I know, draw this parallel precisely to friend-enemy distinction, but it boils down to the same thing, which is something that I focus on a lot, which is that fundamentally you can't run a society where the divergence of opinion on norms is too great, because you inevitably end up, and again, what he discusses a lot in Legality and Legitimacy, which is this bizarre situation where you have 51% of the vote, whether democratically or parliamentary, allows that group of people to take actions that the 49% in this system have no right of resistance to. Schmitt is very big on the right of resistance in this work. So I think when you talk about friend-enemy, it not only can be frequently used as a overly trite analysis, it's not clear what that really means. I mean, sure, like everyone has friends and enemies, like, in your personal life, in your political life. But I think what it really means ultimately is you can't run a society with friends and enemies. It also has a foreign policy implication, which he fleshes out in concept called a nation's friend and a nation's enemies and so on. It's focusing on within a nation. Fundamentally, the friend-enemy distinction is closely tied to the fact you just can't have a society where there's a divergence of perception of the way things should be. So I think that's very important for us now. It's not an abstraction. It's because the fact is that there are, and I like to give the example of Merrick Garland. There's no universe in which Merrick Garland is fit to live in the same country as me. He should go to another country, or we should split the country, because I don't want to have anything whatsoever to do with Merrick Garland. I don't want to associate with him. I don't want him to be in my polity. I want him just to leave. So, bye, Merrick, or whatever. Yeah. He's an exemplar. I mean it seriously. I wish he would leave. But
me too.
There's no universe in which in 2026, Merrick and Charles, who now are on a first name basis apparently, get together and talk about how great their common country is. We're over that. So that's kind of my practical application. That's not really directly answering your question, but I kind of dodged it. My practical application of friend-enemy.
Well, hey, the answer the question. I mean, it's perfect politician answer. Answer the question you wanted to ask. It also makes up for a bad, interviewer. But no, I think along those lines, Charles. I think it's really good because you've talked about also no enemies to the right, and this is along those same lines, especially when we talk about this divergence where there are simply two different visions for the country, at least two different visions for America within the modern discourse today. It's just the divergence is so great where we share a country, but we don't share anything else. We share the same physical space, but the regime, the ruling elite, whatever appellation you want to give them, they have a totally different where the world that we grew up in, we love, the America that we love, they despise, they want to destroy, and they are destroying. And so we can't share anything with it. It isn't like the wonderful bucolic days of the 1980s where the Democrats and the Republicans could bicker over 1% difference in marginal income
Yep.
tax,
Exactly.
like that's like, well, they still, we're the same country, we're opposed to the Soviet Union, we're fighting the Cold War together, blah blah blah, like we're on the same side, we're all Americans here. That doesn't exist at all anymore. It's not September 12th 2001. Like that's kind of the bipartisan vision that is always bandied about. But these are people who are in Schmittian terms, they're enemies in the true sense. They're not enemies. They're not like you where you bring up like Plato. They're not fellow Greeks that we're fighting against. This is not Athens versus Sparta. This is Athens versus barbarians. That we're looking at. So
I want to interject here. Like one of the things that people miss when they absorb this type of rhetoric or they just repeat it, they conceive of the situation or they conceive of the narrative here. Like Schmitt is saying that we need to go out and find enemies to conquer, that we need to like look at the masses and recognize that these people with these like ridiculous lifestyles like hippies or something, and we need to conquer them because they don't live up to our way of life. But he's really specifically talking about political friends and political enemies. He's talking about absorbing those themes at the level of power.
yeah,
And the contest for power and the dynamics of politics have to do with specifically, like there's specific boundaries around it. So it's not like the authority, like the people, like the sovereign authority, the one who wields the sword is going out and attacking like these random people, like these gay people, because we don't like the way that they live their life. That's not what the friend and enemy distinction is.
yeah,
It's actually the absorption of different visions of how the world should be and what needs to be done at the political level within the context of power, and they absorb that and they represent a conflict at that level. And the people at large are just kind of reflecting political differences. They're just reflecting the the elites that are having these battles, that are having these struggles. And so these mutually exclusive ways of life are specifically politically related. So I guess Charles, I want you to like elaborate a little bit on the distinction between a private enemy and a public enemy and what that means in terms of Carl Schmitt's focus on the political. Because what he's doing when he talks about the concept of the political is he's juxtaposing politics from its new meaning, which he describes as like a legalism. So there's a difference between like the making of laws and the legality of things and politics as its own category. So just talk about why specifically a public enemy is what he's talking about.
Distinction at some length in my discussion of the concept of the political hostis versus inimicus in the Latin terms, the public enemy and the private enemy. And I'll turn to that in a second, but I'll say two things briefly tied to what you just said. First of all, I think it's important to remember when you're reading Schmitt that the people, that is the German people, when he was writing at the time he wrote, it had an entirely different quality or a largely different quality than the people nowadays. Because, first of all, they're Germans, and Germans are kind of sui generis within a historical Western framework. But the clown factor was orders of magnitude lower. Like even the people who were extremely hostile to the Weimar state, who Schmitt, until he joined up opportunistically and briefly with the National Socialists, he was very concerned about keeping the communists and the National Socialists from gaining power. But I understood perfectly well these were serious men with serious thoughts who could defend their position and didn't say stupid things. They may have said things that were grossly erroneous, but they weren't stupid people. So he was writing for an audience and a time and a place and a civilization that was far less decayed than ours. I mean, certainly the Weimar Germany had its decayed elements, but that's not the mass of the people. So I think it's important to know that he wasn't a big fan of democracy or anything like that. His general view of the competency of the people was much higher than I think anybody sensible person nowadays would lend to the current American population. And then it does change some of the analysis with Schmitt. And while it is true, and I'll move to the hostis inimicus distinction, it is true that when Schmitt says friend enemy, he doesn't mean going out and attacking people for their lifestyle per se. But for example, the gay people are a good example because giving in to the demands of the gay agenda has led to the wholesale destruction of America. So,
right. So he talks about the fact that certain things can become a political issue.
Right. And that's a perfect example of one where, in fact, if you allow the norms to be perverted, then you end up in a political battle about something that's initially seems simply like a social matter.
Right.
But back to Hostis and Amicus. Now I have to dredge up my memory because it's been a couple of months. And but yeah, but I mean, it was Schmitt's basic distinction, and Schmitt was a indifferent. Well, he was a conflicted Catholic in many ways, and so he approached much of this through the Catholic lens and more broadly through the Christian lens. But he drew a distinction between hostis and inimicus in his writing, meaning the private enemy and the public enemy. The private enemy being inimicus, the person you have a beef with, in other words. So he stole my girlfriend, so he's my enemy. That's that's kind of a silly example, but that's not what he's talking about. He's talking about the hostis, which is the public enemy, and that is someone who opposes the will. I mean, I hate to say, I don't want to say the will of the nation, that's National Socialist overtones. That's not what he means at all, but opposes the will of the people in a existential sense. And what he ties this to, and this is something that I wrote about at some length, which I think is very important, because people in our neck of the woods frequently, again, it goes back to this trite kind of use of complex concepts. Well, Jesus said to love your enemies. And so when you talk about friend-enemy distinction, or how you need to advert to the fact that you have enemies, then you're punching Christ, and that's bad. Obviously, punching Christ is bad, but as he points out, the Vulgate, which of course is the initial Latin translation of the New Testament, exclusively uses the word inimicus for enemies, and the Greek words, which are the original, are slightly more ambiguous, but basically carry the same sense, which is Christ is referring exclusively to the private enemy, not to the public enemy. And as Schmitt points out, it would never have occurred in 1,000 years of fighting Islam for Christians to say, well, Muslims aren't our enemies, so we need to just love all the Muslims and roll over for them.
Yeah.
So this
open the gates to Vienna and here
right,
come on in. Yeah.
So I mean, this is tied to a slightly different concept, which is Christ didn't say pretend you don't have any enemies. He said love your enemies, which is also another layer of this discussion. But so many Christians today are completely crippled by this line of attack and this line of thought internally to themselves. They think that when the people are grooming their children in schools, that maybe that's not great, but I really shouldn't complain because I'm not loving them. When the reality is that there's a wide range of things that should be done that you are not in fact.
Look at what Jesus said. Look at what Jesus said about specifically those type of people. What does he say? He says if whoever would harm one of these little ones, it would be better for him to have a millstone tied around his neck and have him be cast into the sea.
In fact,
and it's like
stack of millstones in my backyard. Total coincidence.
Yeah, it's crazy. Charles, I preached on the Gospel of Matthew 2 years ago. And I hadn't read Concept of the Political yet. I wish I would have, because it would have added even more to it. But I looked up my old sermon on Matthew 7, chapter 7, which is the Sermon on the Mount. If you get hit in the cheek, turn the other cheek. So on and so forth. And what I wrote, and there are some Christian commentaries, some Christian tradition that explains this well, not in the same terms as Schmitt, with hostis versus inimicus. Yeah, I don't speak Latin, so I preached on it. I just said, look, this is, for one, it's a slap. It's not a punch. That's what Jesus, clear in the Greek. It's a slap. Two, this is not a fight to the death. This is you being embarrassed and you being humiliated by someone. It's not someone assaulting you and beating you up, and it's not like the Marine on the subway, right? It's not a situation like that. It is you need to turn. It's this this private enemy who is humiliating you that you need to. And this is the language I use. This private enemy who you need to bear with and lay down your life for. It is not the same. Jesus is not preaching pacifism here. He's not saying, all right, when your enemy is at the gates and he's going to come, You just think of like the Middle Ages or the ancient world. And you're fighting. The Assyrians are surrounding Jerusalem, and they have an army of 100,000, and they're gonna come. They're gonna kill all of you. They're gonna take your children as slaves, and they're gonna rape all your women. And you think, well, we better just open the gates and let them in. Like that's insane. Jesus is not preaching that at all. Not at all. You read the entire Bible and the whole rest of the Bible. It's not preaching pacifism. It's saying to lay down your life for your private enemies. These people, and it's the same question of like, who is my neighbor, right? It's the people you come into contact every single day. It's not if you are a Russian or Ukrainian soldier, the majority of whom profess Christ. Are they supposed to just say, well, we're not going to fight in this war for our countries because Jesus said not to kill? No, it's insane.
I mean, this is a fraught topic. I think that's a good analysis. I think the humility part of it is actually very, very notable. That is, Christ preaches humility. When people slap you, you're not reacting in a prideful fashion is very difficult, and something obviously that's desired. It is true, however, that pacifism up until around the millennium was the dominant or largely the dominant strain in a lot of Christian thinking. Not all of it, but I mean, you saw this particularly in Eastern Christianity, that there was what pacifism wasn't required, but there was a definite tension. There's, for example, obviously you could be a soldier, but the principle in the Eastern Church for a long time was that soldiers who killed somebody still had to go to confession before receiving the sacraments, not because they had sinned per se. The Orthodox view of confession is somewhat different than the Catholic view of confession, but simply because you weren't killing people, even if it was justified morally, wasn't fully measuring up to the standard that Christ had set. So I think it's important. I mean, I don't want to be cavalier about enemies. I do think all my enemies need to be moved into a new country that's about 10 miles square. But yeah, it may be somewhere like in southern Nevada, maybe. But I don't mean overly cavalier. It's like I did this review of not very good science fiction trilogy. One of the books is Red Rising, but it does have a good opening line, which is, "I would have lived in peace, but my enemies brought me war." And so, I mean, and that's basically where we are. I mean, you could argue that for most things. Sometimes it's a facetious argument. So, I mean, for example, but like if you're a Ukrainian or a Russian, you could argue both sides. You could say, well, it's their fault, or it's, but so it's generally a reasonable argument. But we shouldn't be overly cavalier about it, I guess is my point.
One of the things that's interesting to me is like, this is a very people don't like the language of friend enemy, and yet it's ironic because they tend to be more especially Americans tend to be more favorable toward the U.S. military and its objectives and activities than myself and Andrew, and I'm sure you as well. They tend to be more favorable toward those things. I mean, they can think in terms of friends and enemies when it's beneficial for the regime, because the regime does operate politically. The regime is a decider between friends and enemies. And so, you cannot deny in politics the existence of these categories. But what is happening is the ideology that kind of sustains the American way is that we've transcended the friend enemy distinction. We've transcended politics. They kind of see the 20th century as like the conquering of politics. Politics is something that held back Western civilization, and it was because of the liberal democratic ideology that came forth and defeated the old world that we now can transcend politics. And this type of rhetoric was in place in the post-progressive era. It was in place in Germany in 1920s. And so what was happening for Schmitt is he was saying, there are consequences, and this is where I'm going to ask you a question, but there are consequences for denying the political. You're not actually going to eradicate the political, but by suppressing it and pretending like it doesn't exist, you're going to get a totalitarianism. You're going to get the total state. So I don't know if you're prepared yet to talk about those themes of Schmitt, but in your mind right now, what are the consequences of denying the concept of the political?
Well, it's the consequence of denying any facet of reality. It erodes any kind of coherent society, because you're living in this fantasy world and trying to impose a alien anti-reality framework upon the reality of things. So denying, I mean, but there is this concept of denying the political. Schmitt goes on at great length criticizing Hans Kelsen and these other legal positivists of early 20th century Germany in their interpretations of the Weimar Constitution, where they argued, well, since everybody has to have an equal chance to gain power, and these are the relatively easy ways to amend the Constitution, if a group that desires to destroy the society, the typical examples being the communists and the National Socialists, and they get electoral power, they should be allowed to do that. Whereas Schmitt argued that that was carrying legal positivism, the idea that politics was existential politics have been superseded entirely too far because it would lead to national suicide. Suicide is his term, and of course that's what we get. That's what they got, right. Obviously, and it ended very, very badly for them. But I think your first point there is actually the most important for our current situation, which is the regime is fully capable of playing politics, and that political action fundamentally revolves around the exact same thing that a lot of German politics revolved around, which is denying, and more frequently the left-wing politics tends to revolve around universally in any country, Finland and Spain and other places, is denying legitimacy to anything that is not left. And so you see this most notably, people have been noticing the extreme uptick in claims by people like President Biden, about white supremacy and white nationalism, and they say, well, and people correctly say, well, and obviously it flows into Christian nationalism. It's all tarred with the same brush. But when people respond by saying, well, where are these white supremacists? Under which bed are they? But they don't seem to understand that it's not meant to be real. It's merely meant to be a rhetorical device to deny legitimacy to anybody who's not part of the regime. And so we're back where we started, which is they have identified themselves as our enemies.
Right.
And that's just the way it is. Schmitt would probably say the same thing.
So let me ask you this then. In your mind, what is the significance of, there's sort of been a rehabilitation of Carl Schmitt on the left, and yet the conservative movement in America and the West is very, they don't like to speak in these terms. They like to appeal to more classically liberal categories. What are the consequences of a left being aware of the friend-enemy distinction, but us having no right that is equally aware of these distinctions? What's happening here?
Well, I read no French, but my understanding is that Schmitt has been popular since World War II in France among the left, and more generally among the European left for this, among other reasons. But the consequences are an eternal Jordan Peterson simpering and crying in his chair. I mean, that's what the consequences are. I mean, that's just what it is.
This is exclusive content right here.
This is the best. Yes.
Because but that's just, I always complain about the left denying reality, but the people on the right who deny this are also denying reality. So what you end up with is this. And James Lindsay, who everybody's been beating on. I mean, it's like beating up on the class retard. I mean, it's not really like fair. I mean, everyone's beating up on Lindsay because he says these insane, self-contradictory, nonsensical things, but he's trapped within his own frame. So the consequence is not just clownishness, it's allowing the evil people who run the regime, the same people who are pushing this friend-enemy distinction, is exemplified by these claims of white supremacy or whatever and illegitimacy. It's giving them power by refusing to push back against them in a way that's necessary.
Yeah. So I have one thing I want to share. See if it works. I'm the world's boomeriest millennial when it comes to technology. I know I'm not, but when it comes to technology, I am. So let me let me see if here we go.
Sharing?
Here we go. I'm sharing something. Here we go. Yes, found it. So this is I don't know if you've seen Ryan Burge. Burge, I think is his name, but he does a lot of data polling, all that kind of stuff,
okay.
And he did some charting on just religious affiliation and political activity, political action, voting, and so forth. And what he shows here is that white evangelicals, and as far as political acts, it's like going to a rally, giving money to a politician, calling a congressman or emailing a congressman, things of that nature. And here's on average, the average white evangelical does that at about 0.8 right per year, right, but the average atheist is 1.5, like way at the very top. Then Jews are over here, then agnostics, Buddhists, mainline, way ahead of white evangelicals. And so all this is to say is that American evangelicals make up the largest percentage of as far as a religious group, white evangelicals. We've talked about this, the lone bulwark, Stephen Wolf's tweet, and all of that. But this group is largely apolitical. They're not engaged in politics at all. They've been told, and the CJ, I think, has been saying, just recently said that they're not engaged politically. They think that politics is basically over, or that liberalism defeated politics, or whatever. And within American Christianity, especially conservative evangelicalism, there's this idea. I mean, some of it is this: we don't have any enemies. Jesus said to be nice to your enemies and just let them groom your children. Like, some of it is that mindset. Some of it is, well, we don't want to lose our 501c3 and we can't be political, separation of church and state. Some of it's that. I mean, there's all sorts of reasons. But you look at people like James Lindsay and the people pushing back against Christian nationalism. I think it's because it's the same principle as the regime, where if you take this group, right, and you make the white evangelicals, which represent tens of millions of people, and you move them to be, not even as political as the average Jew, but as political as the average, agnostic, or even the average mainline Christian. And I mean, that's a sea change in American politics, right? That's a massive shift in terms of the balance of what could happen. And so I think much of the furor over Christian nationalism isn't like, guys like Andrew Isker and Andrew Torba and Stephen Wolf, they want to create the American Taliban and take over the government and all this kind of stuff. It's like, no, actually, I just want Christians to fight for their country instead of giving up. Right,
Yes.
that's what I'm trying to do, and so talk about this a little bit.
I think they're terrified of that possibility. I mean, I would move mainline up into, I'd lump it together with agnostic, but be that as it may. I think they're terrified of this possibility. It's not. I mean, this is not to them. These attacks on Christian nationalism and other branches of that same tree aren't because they have a philosophical objection. It's because they realize you're precisely right, that the evangelical Christians in general, and certainly white people in general, have long been basically told to shut up and not act in their interests, even when they're being directly attacked. And so the regime, I of course am known for purporting the theory.
Proliferating,
putting forth the theory that the regime is extremely fragile, not powerful, but unable to resist a crisis. And so I think they know that. Whether they enunciate that to themselves, I don't know. But in any kind of massive power shift, the resulting from a crisis, or power shift isn't the right term, a power shift would result from white evangelicals, or evangelicals in general, actually taking political action. It would be impossible for the regime to withstand. And the demoralizing, terrorizing, atomizing these people is one of the top goals of the regime. It's not going to work out, because the reality is that these kind of massive political sea changes resulting from larger crises are the norm in all Western societal experience. We've just not had any in so long that we pretend that they don't exist. Along the same lines that CJ was talking about, that we've managed to pretend that we've transcended politics. But this is a variation on the same point. History will return, as I've been telling my children for several years now. History will return, and I like history. My own personal family history relates to this, because my mother fled the communists in 1945 in Hungary, and she can remember, even though she was only 7, how in my grandfather's car, They had German potato masher grenades on the dashboard as they were driving. And so Americans can't comprehend that in living memory of people still alive, people in Western societies did things that are incomprehensible to them. But we're just one crisis away from the white evangelicals deciding they've had enough. And the regime's entire megaphone narrative machine, as Michael Anton refers to that megaphone and the narrative, is devoted to keeping exactly what you suggest should happen from happening.
What I mean, just to I mean, we've been through some crises already. 2020 had multiple ones. I mean, I think it's all one big one. But what would be the thing that would push them over the edge? Because there's so many things. I mean, for me personally, the people that I interact with in real life, the Christians I interact with in real life that I've been able to bring into my church and minister to, it's because like they saw the things that happened in 2020 and they now are open to rethinking politics at like a fundamental level. And so like but that's a small fraction, right? If just Christians in my own little town. So what would be the thing that would push that entire block over the edge into political action? What would it take?
This is a difficult question to answer because historical parallels aren't great. Anton had a piece, which I always refer people to in the New Criterion, called Unprecedented last year, which is fantastic because it discusses that we've never been in a situation, no Western society, no Eastern society, no society in human history has ever been in the kind of situation we are now with the kind of regime we have, which actively acts, hates the people it rules. He goes through this in great detail. And at the same time, what happens in crises is difficult to predict on a historical basis because of the effeminate nature of our society, the elderly nature of our society. There's a whole bunch of kind of characteristics that have never existed in a broad society before. So it's hard to predict what will happen. But I mean, the obvious candidates are a real pandemic that actually kills. If there were a pandemic that killed, say, 5% of children who got it, everything would grind to a halt instantaneously because all the people who actually deliver goods aren't going to take the risk for that. And so or loss of a war. I mean, the United States will almost certainly lose any war it gets into with China and maybe with Russia as well. I'm not, current enough with tactical stuff to say about that. So that could, I mean, any of these things, or of course, everyone's favorite, economic, at least 80% of GDP is totally fake, right? So most people work at jobs that in reality, no one would. It's what I don't know if I can swear on this podcast, but David Graeber, the late David Graeber, had this book, Bullshit Jobs. And
it's a family show. It's a family show. Go ahead. No, that's okay.
BS Jobs, and he talked about this that a BS job is one where if it were made illegal, no black market would develop. Not in. I think it's really the most 80% of the jobs you can think of fit into that category, and so eventually the stupid will get squeezed out of the system. But so many people have no way to live other than being handed free money, and when that money can't buy anything or isn't worth anything, well, all bets are off. So something like that, I guess, but it's very hard to predict.
I keep thinking of this. I had a conversation a few hours ago for Chronicles on the Camp of the Saints book, and we talked at length about the fact that there's this situation where the armada of immigrants comes to the shores of France, and the French leader, he's unwilling to make a decision. He's unwilling to defend his people because he had been so demoralized, and there's this entire spirit that's been ingrained by all Western elites to hate themselves. They're characterized by self-loathing and a type of nihilism that just makes them completely unable to fight for themselves, but rather they have to pursue this like universalistic, like ideological aspect that actually gives them the moral imperative to defeat their own heritage.
Yes, absolutely.
And I mean, like you said, I can't think of any other situation that's like that, but it so accurately describes the entire West right now. There's just there's this imperative to destroy themselves. It's amazing.
I haven't read Camp of the Saints, though I have a copy and intend to read it at some point. But I mean, there's an easy 2-word answer to solve the problem described in that, or for that matter, at our own border, cluster bombs.
Mhm.
I mean, that's the answer to that problem.
Well,
And
this
then
is
once you drop a bunch of cluster bombs, no more people will be arriving, and the people
well,
who
that's
are arriving
and
will no longer be arriving.
right. That's what he said. And part of the book is that the Armada first visits Egypt, right? Because it first wants to, make home in Egypt for the third world. And the Egyptians literally just said, if you don't leave right now, we're going to destroy you.
Yeah,
They made a political decision. But when they get to
Yeah.
France, this is an analogy. This is a spiritual analogy of the spiritual malaise of the West. The French they're not willing to commit themselves to that type of political decision. And in fact, what he says is so it's amazingly how prophetic this scenario is, because what he says is he delegates his authority as the leader of the embodiment of French interests. He delegates that authority back to individuals, and he says, "Well, it's up for individuals to decide whether they want to welcome them or not." He delegates his own authority because he's not willing he's not willing to stand up for his own people. I mean, that's amazingly prescient.
well, this is why Viktor Orban, Europe in general is screwed, but Viktor Orban is awesome, and the Poles aren't too bad at these things. So Viktor Orban's problem is that he's a tiny country dependent upon Germany and other people, and no doubt a color revolution is coming for him. But there are still, even in Europe, a few people who will stand up for the national interest. But when was Camp of the Saints written? In the 1960s?
Yeah, 70s,
Yeah.
early
Yeah.
70s.
So I mean, but I am an American optimist in the sense that I think a 5% of the Americans need to find a new country. But I think that that would not happen, broadly speaking, in America. I mean, it's happening now in the sense of a somewhat less alien group of people is invading, but it's not. And so maybe this contradicts it. But the fact is that nobody, because they're back to the unprecedented thing, they're being welcomed in by this illegitimate regime that rules us, and things haven't gone bad enough for that regime to get, as Schmitt would talk about, the right of resistance. And so I think maybe we end up in the same place with a slow motion invasion changing the country, and we end up just as bad off as the Camp of the Saints. Probably not, but I think that in a crisis situation, the people would emerge in America in a way that they would not in Europe. I think the description of Europe is accurate, but something different might happen in America. But maybe
but the problem is that culturally and institutionally, even beyond the issue of immigration, formally speaking, the problem is that there's this spirit of just self-defeatism, sort of a willingness to die that characterizes, I think, even like the American populace at large. I think all of their little boycotts of things like Bud Light and all those things are just so fleeting and temporary. They're not really willing, they don't really see themselves as having a culture to preserve that transcends, the ability of like the markets and consumer goods and all those things to percolate and to kind of just distract, like, like all the sports and the media and the entertainment and the gadgets and all these things. I think they take more priority than any cultural allegiance of the American people at large. And so I see it in a different sense. It's not immigration, but I do see just this exhaustion in the West, including America.
But it's impossible to say whether this would be true. But part of the reason is, as you've identified, because they can buy Bud Light, they can watch the sports, they can play the computer games. Mm-hmm. By definition, if you posit that a crisis will come, and crises will come because that's just the way the world works, my theory is that a large amount of Americans could be recatechized in a way that I don't think Europeans can. I think for the most part, Europeans are way farther down the curve of civilizational suicide and self-hatred than the average American, who is more just enervated, fat, stupid, and lazy, and satiated with these various entertainments which the regime feeds him. But he could be recatechized if he couldn't feed his children, and he took the necessary actions to change his situation. In the right situation, Americans could be recatechized and reborn, for lack of a better.
And this is,
I could be wrong about that, though.
And that's perhaps why there's this kind of like this the anticipating narratives, like the white supremacist terrorist narrative, like anticipating because eventually things are going to crack, and it may be economically motivated, but just eventually things are going to crack, and people are going to realize, wait a minute, we actually are losing things that we love, and so they have to anticipate those types of reactions by categorizing them now as basically being like white supremacist terrorists, and they're
Absolutely.
preparing the grounds for this narrative posturing.
These people are all completely ignorant of history. So much of this, I think, is instinctual. I mean, these people, it's fundamentally, these people are snakes, and they act on an instinctual basis towards evil. So it's not like they're carefully parsing history, or anyone in the Biden White House is able to parse history. But if they were, instinctually, they realize what is definitely true, which is that massive societal changes are a step function. One day they're not, the next day they are. They're not. There's not some kind of smooth curve to get to. Here's the regime being in charge, and we go slowly down here, and here the hated so-called white supremacists are in charge. If there were to be a flip, it'd be like this, right? One day the regime is now taking boats to go live in England or some other language, some other country, and they feel that. They feel that in their bones. They're afraid.
Yeah.
And they should be afraid.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So let me ask you this, Charles. Are the enemies within the gates, or are the enemies outside still?
Well, my Twitter bio says the hour is late and Moloch is within the gates. So
okay.
I go with within the gates.
there's this narrative on the conservative movement, like Conservative Inc. type side of things, where everything's focused on like the enemies in China and how China's going to get us and they're going to take down our country, and we need to defend ourselves against these foreign enemies. But to what extent is that a distraction, and people need to look more forcefully than they already do at the mechanisms and machinations of DC?
Well, I think it's 100% a distraction. I mean, I don't care about China at all, other than like Kung Pao chicken's pretty good. Is that Chinese? I mean, I think
it's American. Yeah.
Whatever. I don't care what China does. Not at all. Don't care about Taiwan. Don't care about Japan. I mean, we shouldn't defend Japan at all, because a country that won't have any children doesn't deserve to be defended. As far as I'm concerned, the Chinese can have the entire Western Pacific, and as long as they're not too mean to us. In fact, they can probably have Hawaii too, ultimately. I mean, they'll probably take it over with like tourist dollars rather than warships. Yeah. I mean, China, who cares about China? I mean, there's no reason for America to have any presence whatsoever in the Pacific. I mean, and I'm married to an Australian, but Australia is a satrapy of China already. I mean, you have these people probably don't pay attention, but the Australians have been these like effeminate Australian politicians have been pounding their chest and talking about how we're going to have this new alliance with America. And I mean, if the Chinese told them to like bow down and kiss Xi Jinping's shoes, they would instantly do it.
All of them.
So China is complete. I don't understand. I don't watch live TV, so I only get glimpses of this. But I agree that you see this narrative a lot on the American right, or so-called right, or pseudo-right, that China matters. China doesn't matter to America at all. No. None. Zero. I mean,
I agree with you. Yeah. It's a distraction, and it yeah. a lot of our bandwidth and our energy and our resources it just gets like absorbed and sucked up and down a black hole when we push so much of that narrative that like we need to be careful. The Americans need to be careful, because China's out to get them. Like there's this big balloon floating over like Northern America, and it's sopping up. I'm like, dude, have you heard of the NSA? Like, have you heard of the entire apparatus in Washington, D.C.? That's the enemy. Like they're the ones that do this full time, 24/7.
The enemy is 90%, 85% inside American borders, and the other 15% is other regime
satellites
in the Anglosphere. So Britain, Australia, New Zealand.
Israel.
I mean, I actually have more sympathy for Israel than I think a lot of people do on the right. Mostly because I would do what they were doing if I were them. And
that's what I always say too. Yeah.
Look, I like Israel in many ways. They have a lot of children. I'd rather have them rule the Middle East than the Muslims. So they do what they do, and our enemies are, generally speaking, the regime in the Anglosphere, and those are the only enemies. Like Russia is not our enemy either. I mean, I don't really care about Russia. I think all I really care about that area is that Subcarpathian Ukraine, which is now Subcarpathian Ruthenia, which is now part of Ukraine, should be given back to Hungary. But other than that, I don't really care about neck of the woods. Let the Russians do what they want to do, and I don't care about the Europeans. I don't want to defend the Europeans because, again, why should we do it when they won't do it for themselves?
Precisely. Yeah, they won't even defend their own borders. They're allowing themselves to be invaded. And I mean, some of it is it's at the behest of the American regime. Like they are just vassal states that do whatever. I mean, it's the same thing. Like you describe Australia, right? You describe Australia with China. Well, Germany is like that with us, where we bomb their main source of oil or natural gas, and they're like, "Oh, thank you, America. We love you so much." It's like.
Bizarre. I mean, it's
insane.
I mean, the Australian thing is particularly interesting because they're a vassal state of two different empires.
Yeah.
They're an economic vassal of China, and they're a political vassal of America, and political and cultural / social vassal of America. I mean, I cannot describe to you how ruinous Australia is as a nation in terms of the loserness of its people. During the Wuhan plague and just in general. I mean, most Americans have this bizarrely inaccurate conception of Australia as a land of rugged individualists. I mean, like that.
No. Did you see the stand-up? There's a bit that was going around Twitter of the stand-up comedian from Australia where he's like, he's like, "Oh, I'll do whatever you tell me just so I can go back to the pub." He's like, "We all think that we would have opposed Hitler."
Oh, I did,
and it's like, it's like,
oh,
I would have been pointing out at Frank's house just to be able to get to go to the pub.
Right.
It's like, yeah, that's the way people are, especially there, especially there.
Guns and Australians are total sheeple. I mean, in 1910 it was probably different, but even then they were probably more so than Americans. More sheepleish, but in 1910 it was a long time ago. I hate to break it to you.
Yeah, they lost all their best men at Gallipoli. That's basically also what happened.
Right? I mean, even like my wife's grandfather who fought the Japanese in Papua New Guinea in World War II. Yeah. I mean, Americans can't conceive of how brutal like a lot of the jungle wars against the Japanese. Oh. You see a little bit of it, but most of the American battles against the Japanese were standoff battles. The Australians did a lot of jungle fighting, like the English did in Burma and so on, with the Japanese. So those were men, but all the men went away somewhere, and it's like, I mean, New Zealand, of course, is even worse Chinocracy, but it's just terrible. So I'm not even super negative on this podcast. I'm like actually positive. You're the guy.
Yeah, we are turning you, like, because I always tell people, like, you have this spectrum of where could things go, and I'm like, well, you got Charles Haywood on the one side, where it's like, here's the regime could collapse any minute, and then you have Niccolo Soldo on the other, where Turbo America, 1,000-year American Empire, the regime is forever, and it's like, and we're turning you into Niccolo Soldo.
No, I'm a big Soldo fan. I mean, he and I are friends.
Me too.
I've never met in real life, but certainly, so I have a lot of respect for Soldo and so on. But I have responded to him directly in several pieces. Yeah. And he's aware of that. I mean, I keep waiting for him to write to give me some love. He did give me some love back the other day on a different piece. So one of us is right.
That's right. Yeah, I hope it's you. I mean, I think so. I mean, some of it is like I'm not so. I mean, CJ is pretty black pilled. Is that accurate? Is that accurate? I mean, his Twitter bio is the Spengler quote. Optimism is cowardice. So let's just leave that there. But I think, I mean, just looking at that chart and I look at the the project that we're engaged in that I'm apparently the leading activist for, is that I mean, honestly, like shifting American evangelicals into actively politically engaging with their faith in Christ in mind, is a huge paradigm shift that the regime again is terrified of. I mean, this is why David French has a job. I mean, this horrid mediocrity. I know. I'm sorry. Like David French, Russell Moore, all of these people. I mean, so much of regime evangelicalism, like, it exists at a top level because like the regime sustains it and wants it and props these people up. Because you have to.
I have David French in my mind, and I'm throwing.
Well, I'll say some good things to distract from that. But it's the you get, I mean, you clear those people out, and the past 3 years has destroyed their credibility in a way they will never recover. They will never recover it. People do not listen to these guys anymore, especially important people, people that lead churches. They're now much more open to these ideas, and so some of these fights that I'm involved in online and everything with different Christian groups, some of it is just there's a new paradigm, a new situation politically that American Christians are currently facing, and so many people are clinging to the old way of life. I mean, obviously, Aaron Renn, and like his three worlds of evangelicalism, I think is absolutely brilliant. I reference it all the time.
There's a book coming out in January on that.
Yes, I cannot wait. And so anyway, so many people are clinging to the old neutral world, but now we're in negative world, and Christians becoming adapted to that, and Christian leaders kind of rising that are adapted to this negative world, ready to fight. I mean, that's the big thing. I mean, so many. I mentioned this online, I think yesterday. There's one of my favorite mutuals, Glomar Responder. He came back. Elon let him come back.
Mm-hmm.
Mr. X, awesome dude. And he mentioned that in the 2010s he was this atheist, or early he was an atheist, and the thing that turned him off from church was that it was not a place for men, right? It was just this gynocracy, right? That Stephen Wolfe talks about, and so what if you have a church that is actively fighting, that's actually led by men, not just nominally, where the men, are do the bidding of the women, where they officially have all the titles, but everything in the back of their head is, oh, what are the ladies going to think about this? Yeah. But actually, a church that's led by men, as men, boldly going forth. Your churches like that are attractive to all sorts of guys who haven't really cared about church at all. And there's so many people that want to be led. That people are desperate for leaders. I mean, you talked with my friends at New Founding the other day about like a Red Caesar, and I mean, people are desperate for that, but they're also desperate for leadership of that kind locally, in real life. And so like that I think to give you the white pill for today, like those things are happening. Those kind of pastors and leaders are coming forth. Like they're rising through the ranks, and God is raising them up to.
I agree. And CJ, you've got to not be black-pilled. You got to say yes. Right.
I'm not a defeatist, and no. I'm doing this podcast, and I have my real name on it, and I am active.
This isn't my real name, by the way.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Cool. Well, hey guys, I actually got to run. So I don't know if you want to keep going, but I actually do have to bail.
Yeah, CJ has to bail. I think. Do you have more time, Charles, or we
just
can?
A few minutes.
Okay.
The kids are home from school, so I need to go beat them.
Yeah. Yes, as a good patriarch should. Yes, of course.
Paddle. No, but I have a few minutes certainly.
Okay. Well, CJ, do you have anything you want to plug before we say goodbye?
I always forget my Twitter, at Contra Mordor on Twitter, and my Substack is linked over there. And that's it. That's what I do. Chronicles Magazine podcast. We'll have Charles on soon. That'd be great. And you can talk to Paul. You and Paul should.
I've corresponded a little bit with Paul last year. He occasionally reads my stuff. I read his stuff all the time, obviously.
But anyways, it was good to talk to you guys.
Nice talking to you.
See you, CJ. Yeah, Charles, we'll talk a little bit longer here, and I really appreciate all the time that you're giving us here today. And so I look at the future of really optimistically. I mean, even I mentioned like, well, what's the thing that's going to push them over the line? Because I'm not naive. There are a lot of I have to deal with evangelicals who are trapped in this paradigm, especially evangelical men who. They're very passive. I mean, they're typical American men. They're very passive. They're very submissive to their wives. They're just not comfortable in their own skin. And so you talk about. I mean, for me, like I tell them, like read the Psalms, right? Read the Psalms and look at how David is talking about Jesus. And how is he talking about Jesus? He's talking about Jesus defeating his enemies. Like so many of the Psalms, that's what's happening. Right, his enemies are getting clobbered by Jesus, and so like you read that, and then you
Psalms for Lent. The Orthodox do it in what they call kathismas, which
Yeah.
is divided into 20 sections. So groups read the Psalms continuously. So yes, that's very, very evident in the Psalms.
Oh yeah, and so some of it. I mean, I look at like even like I use the Revised Common Lectionary. It's just it's pretty standard Protestant lectionary, but I have to revise the Revised Common Lectionary because it was written in the mid 20th century, compiled in the mid 20th century. And when you read the Psalms, they always cut out all the good parts, right? They always cut out all the parts where the bad guys are getting their teeth smashed in, and so I'm like, we did read this, and part of it, I mean, this is one of my intellectual mentors, I guess. One of the men that I gained so much from is James B. Jordan. I almost said Jim Jordan. People always get confused. They think I'm talking about the congressman. But James B. Jordan, his main thing is like the church needs the Psalms badly. If we sing the Psalms and we know them deep in our bones, then when you read the Gospels and you think about Jesus, he's not this hippie flower child wimpy guy. He is a king with a sword.
I saw this.
He rules.
I saw this meme the other day that again, I can't really do memes justice, but basically it showed a priestess of some kind with behind a pulpit with a rainbow flag and this "Love is Love" sign, and Jesus was at the door, coming in the door, holding a whip. And she was looking up at the podium saying, "And who are you?"
Yes, I mean that's just it. I mean, so much of it, like we're in a time, I think, in the church that is, at least in like the history of the Western Church is, I think, very analogous to the time of the Reformation. Just a tremendous amount of religious upheaval, and a ton of reform of so much of the dross and the dreck that has just glommed onto the church over the last few hundred years.
I, of course, am noted for analyses. I'm noted for anything. I'm noted for the fact that I focus on what the left is and how it has destroyed the West since the Enlightenment. But I think on a more narrower scale, and while the two things are definitely related, they're not the same thing. The feminization of American society has been by far the most disastrous thing that has led to the direct implementation of a lot of these horrors that are not necessarily would not necessarily otherwise have been prime objectives of a leftist movement. I also think it's an interesting thing. I saw a guy, William Briggs, who's on Twitter, and he has this as a site too, and I'm friends with him. He had a very interesting point the other day, which is that normally at this point in the cycle of leftist regimes, you'd see much more open and naked political terror, like people disappearing in the middle of the night, being killed, and so on. I think in American context that would lead to war, but regardless, we don't see that. And even like the electoral justice protest, I mean, sure, the terrorization of the people who participate in electoral justice protest is a crime against humanity that needs to be severely punished for everybody involved when we come to power. I mean, everybody, down to secretaries, like, during the Holocaust, they now still persecute secretaries.
96-year-old secretaries,
We should do the same thing for anybody involved in persecuting electoral justice protesters. But leaving that aside, the reality is, by historical standards, spending 6 months in jail is hardly the end of the world. I mean, it's very bad, and I don't want to spend 6 months in jail. But I mean, Briggs made the excellent point that this is probably a function of the feminization of the left. That is, the left, the men kill other men that they don't like. They're back to friend-enemy distinction. That's what they do, especially when you're a cretinous leftist. They just kill people because that's what they do. But now, feminized people don't do that. They act in a consensus-based fashion where we have correction, and so they have a tremendous amount of hate, but their actual physical actions tend to be very different from those of men. So I thought that was a very interesting insight that cuts both ways. The feminization of America has largely destroyed America, but in terms of like people actually getting killed or otherwise severely hurt. I mean, some people are getting killed, obviously, by the government. But
just look at for example. I think a good historical example is, I mean, we could get into who killed JFK and why, but I mean, say the regime. You say we take Tucker Carlson's line, right, that it was the CIA that killed Kennedy. That's back when America was masculine. And I mean, these are the Dulles and the men that ran the CIA. Like, these are World War II veterans. These are men who you bring up, the war against Japan. If you watch the HBO series, The Pacific, it's very much just brutal combat. And these are men who experienced that, leading the CIA. And then it's like, here's this guy we don't like. Well, we'll just take him out. Right. Yeah. Fast forward to 20. I mean, this is like the current events, the Durham report. Like, fast forward to this week, and you find out, if you didn't already understand this, that the entire regime, all the major players, the most they could do is just write up a fake dossier and try to remove the president.
Right,
that's the equivalent.
Intelligent one. I mean, like, one obvious to anybody who's intelligent, and it's total weeniness. I mean, I'm not encouraging. I don't want the regime to just go off and pull assassination.
No, that's not what we're arguing. But it's just an analysis. Like, it's amazing that they cannot bring themselves to do this stuff anymore.
Yeah. And so, like, a lot of Americans worry about they're going to come confiscate the guns. They're never going to come confiscate the guns, because that would lead to violence, and they're not prepared to accept the widespread violence or the risks of that. I mean, it's multifaceted. It's not just they don't.
No, the way that they will do gun control is this very feminized, almost this manipulative legal way where you get all the DAs to come in and you prosecute anyone like Kyle Rittenhouse. That
only works in a narrow set of places that they already politically control. And so
exactly.
It's crap for advancing the regime goal of stability. And so they're another facet of feminization is that they're just afraid. I mean, being fearful. They're fearful. I said earlier the regime was fearful, and they should be fearful. They're fearful, and because it's feminized. I keep like every podcast I'm on, I keep bringing up this quote of Cicero about Caesar during the Caesar civil wars. That Cicero was an opponent of Caesar, but he described Caesar as a man of unsurpassed daring, hardened to every danger. There's nobody like that. So, and the regime isn't like that. You have to do that if you're going to be a winner.
I mean, even just looking at like the Bolshevik Revolution, like, look at Lenin. This is not a guy who is like, oh, what happens if we lose? Like that's not even a thought. It's like, well, we're going. These are people that are all in. Like, they've committed their lives to it, and the regime's not that way at all. It's like they inherited.
There's not a single person in the regime like that. Most of those people are on Xanax or gender drugs or whatever. I mean, I have no respect whatsoever for the regime. It doesn't mean the regime isn't dangerous. A flailing child in a backhoe, as the analogy I've used before, can cause a lot of damage. The fact I cannot think. I don't have a lot of respect for most people on the kind of mainstream right either, as you can tell from some of my earlier comments. But I can't think of a single person. Let me think. Like, anybody in the regime, anybody that I have any respect for whatsoever, that I don't have total contempt for. And I mean, I shouldn't say, it's kind of, contempt is in fact a emotion that Christians should avoid, but I still have total contempt for them.
I think, I mean, it's deserved. It's, I think about that too. Like, there's not a single, I mean, even, you look at, like, if I'm thinking about if I were in the regime, or if I were, an apparatchik somewhere in the regime, like, who would I want to be the next, president? Who would I want? It would. I mean, the obvious answer I think is probably like Gavin Newsom, but even that guy, he's just good looking. That's the only thing about him. Like, he's not some brilliant strategist.
No intelligence.
They have no one.
They're not sending their best.
No,
because they have no best to send. It's not like they're hitting.
There is no best. Yeah, there is no best. I mean, and some of it I think is their whole system is based on this kind of nepotism and the sycophancy and all of these things like that, where it's just like the worst rise to the top. There is no best that rises through the ranks. There are no bold people, because like some of it is like, just think if you are on the left and you're a man, and you're a man of great talent and charisma and ability, you're not going to rise to the top. You're going to be pushed down to the bottom.
Yeah.
right? You have to know
That's
this.
why
So
those guys go into finance and things like that. Like
yeah,
you don't see men in leftist political positions. Anybody who's highly intelligent and capable is going to go into finance or maybe law for people who are really dumb. I used to be a lawyer. But finance, but of course, finance. Back to our earlier conversation is all fake. I mean,
Yeah.
finance is not finance in the sense it's historically understood. It's financial engineering that has no social value or almost no social value. So
yeah.
anyway, so we should probably wrap it up because
Yes.
children like
Yes.
that.
What? Yes. So, and again, thank you so much for your time. I mean, what stuff do you want people to plug? I mean, our
Well,
podcast audience is growing, but it's not huge. But yeah, we want to send people your way.
The more the better. So my primary site is theworthyhouse.com. I'm on Twitter and stuff too, but I'm not a hot takes guy. I don't get into cool high profile fights like Andrew. Well,
Yet.
But theworthyhouse.com is where I do most of my writing. So go there, check it out. I got something like 500 pieces written. So many of them are book reviews that are actually my thoughts masquerading as book reviews. So check it out.
Well, thank you so much for your time here, Charles. And yeah, if everyone's made it this far, I recommend everything that Charles writes. You will benefit from it greatly. Listen to his podcast. He appears all over the place. Follow him online, and yeah, it's great. As for me, I had an article that just came out. I wrote about the most abused verse in the Bible, which used to be Matthew 7:1. That's been recently overtaken by Galatians 3:28. And so you want to check that one out.
3:28.
That is there is neither Jew nor Greek, male, slave nor free, male. No female, male or female, all are one in Christ.
It has been abused lately. Yeah, I got to check that out. I got to check that out.
Yeah, it's badly abused, and so I had to address this, and so go check that out. There's other articles that are going to come out this week as well at news.gab.com. But that's it for me. And again, thank you to our guest Charles. Thank you to CJ, who had to dip out a little early. And please, like, subscribe, share, all of those things, and get this in front of as many people as possible, because this is an awesome conversation. And again, thank you very much, Charles. And to all of you, thank you. We'll see you next time.